Picture holding a map in your hands, not the kind you'd pull up on your phone today, but one crafted centuries ago, where the edges of the known world dissolved into myth and legend. These weren't just guides for travelers, they were windows into the medieval mind, where faith, fear, and folklore collided with geography. Dragons coiled around unexplored oceans, Jerusalem glowed at the heart of everything, and distant lands teemed with creatures straight out of storybooks. These maps, called mappaemundi, weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were doing something far more revealing, painting the world as people believed it to be, not just as it was. And in their mistakes, they left behind a legacy that shaped empires, inspired explorers, and even influenced how we see our planet today. Think about that for a moment. What if your understanding of the world was built not on satellite images or precise measurements, but on sermons, ancient texts, and travelers' tales whispered across campfires? For medieval cartographers, every blank space on the map was an invitation to fill it with meaning, whether it was the Garden of Eden, the kingdom of Prester John, or sea monsters guarding untold riches. These weren't errors of ignorance, they were choices that reflected what mattered most to the people of their time: faith over facts, symbolism over scale. And that's why these maps matter. They show us how deeply our vision of the world is shaped by what we value, what we fear, and what we dare to imagine. So how did these wrong maps change history? Why did Columbus set sail with a chart that underestimated the size of the ocean? Why did rulers pour treasure into quests for lands that didn't exist? The answers lie in the power of belief, and the surprising ways those beliefs drove real-world consequences, from misplaced continents that redirected trade routes to mythical beasts that stalled exploration. These inaccuracies weren't just quirks of the past. They were forces that altered the course of civilizations, and in tracing their stories, we're not just studying old parchment, we're uncovering how the human imagination, for better or worse, has always been the silent architect of our world. Ready to see geography through medieval eyes? Let's begin. To grasp why medieval maps looked the way they did, we need to step away from modern expectations. Today, we use maps to find the quickest route or pinpoint exact locations, but in the Middle Ages, a map's purpose ran deeper. These weren't tools for plotting a journey, they were visual sermons crafted to teach and inspire. Imagine unrolling a sprawling mappaemundi in a monastery's scriptorium, its ink glowing in candlelight. The parchment wasn't just showing lands and seas, it was telling a story, one where every line carried divine meaning. Jerusalem didn't sit at the center because it was geographically midpoint. It was the spiritual heart of the world, the axis around which all history turned. The artists who drew these maps weren't concerned with scale or precision. Instead, they wove together scripture, legend, and hearsay into a single tapestry. Take the famous Hereford mappaemundi, created around the year 1300. It's cluttered with biblical scenes: Adam and Eve expelled from Eden, Noah's Ark resting on Ararat alongside fantastical creatures like the Blemii, a tribe described as having faces on their chests. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were reminders of God's creation in all its wonder and mystery. Even the map's orientation was symbolic. East, not north, sat at the top, where the sun rose and where paradise was believed to lie. So where did cartographers get their information? Many relied on ancient texts like Ptolemy's Geography, though often copied imperfectly over centuries, or accounts from travelers who'd ventured to distant lands. But these sources were filtered through layers of belief. If a monk read about dog-headed men in a trusted manuscript, he might add them to the map without question. After all, the world was full of divine marvels. Why wouldn't such creatures exist? This wasn't carelessness, it was faith in action. The map's job wasn't to document reality, it was to reflect a higher truth. And that's what makes these maps so fascinating. They reveal how deeply intertwined knowledge and belief once were. A modern atlas might show a blank space where information is lacking, but medieval cartographers filled those gaps with meaning. A sea monster wasn't just a doodle, it marked the unknown as a place of danger and divine mystery. Even the so-called mistakes like Africa merging with Asia or Europe stretched out of proportion were often deliberate choices, emphasizing spiritual narratives over physical accuracy. This symbolic approach had real consequences. When explorers like Columbus set sail centuries later, they carried maps steeped in these traditions, maps that hinted at undiscovered paradises or shortcuts to the east. The medieval worldview, etched onto parchment, quietly shaped the age of exploration. So the next time you glance at a satellite image on your phone, pause for a moment. Our maps today show us where we are, but those ancient charts, they tell us who we thought we were. If you opened a medieval map expecting a reliable guide to the world, you might be in for a shock. Cartographers worked with a patchwork of sources, some ancient, some speculative, and many wildly contradictory. Take Ptolemy's Geography, a 2nd century masterpiece that laid the groundwork for scientific mapping. Though it was revolutionary for its time, medieval Europe only rediscovered it through Arabic translations centuries later, and even then, copies were often incomplete or distorted. Imagine trying to reconstruct a puzzle with half the pieces missing. That's what mapmakers faced. Without first-hand knowledge of distant lands, they filled gaps with fragments from Roman scholars, biblical stories, and the occasional tall tale from a returning merchant. One of the most persistent myths, the land of the dog-headed men, or cynosfolly, which popped up on maps well into the Renaissance, the idea didn't come from nowhere. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder mentioned tribes with animal features, and these accounts, repeated in medieval bestiaries, became gospel. To a monk sketching a map in a candlelit scriptorium, if an ancient authority claimed such creatures existed, who was he to disagree? The same logic applied to other marvels, giants guarding mountain passes, tribes with no heads but faces on their chests, even entire kingdoms ruled by mythical Christian kings like Prester John. These weren't just whimsical decorations, they reflected a world where the boundaries between fact and faith were blurry at best. Even supposedly reliable eyewitnesses could lead cartographers astray. Marco Polo's travelogue, for instance, described riches and wonders from his journey to Asia, but his accounts were often embellished or misunderstood. When he mentioned unicorns, he was likely describing rhinoceroses, but mapmakers took him literally, sketching one-horned beasts in the margins of their charts. And because few Europeans had traveled as far as Polo, his words carried enormous weight. A single exaggerated detail could shape maps for generations, cementing myths as geography. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. Medieval maps weren't just wrong, they were wrong for fascinating reasons. A cartographer might place a vast inland sea in Africa because a Roman geographer had mentioned it 2,000 years earlier. Or he'd sketch the Earth as a perfect circle, not because he didn't know better, but because the shape symbolized divine harmony. These choices reveal a world-view where accuracy took a backseat to meaning. Every misplaced mountain, every mythical creature, every distorted coastline was a clue to what people valued and what they feared. So the next time you see a medieval map dotted with monsters and marvels, don't dismiss it as primitive. Instead, read it like a cultural fingerprint. Those so-called mistakes weren't failures of knowledge. They were proof of how deeply maps are shaped by the hands and minds that draw them. And that's a lesson that still resonates today. After all, isn't every map in some way a reflection of the world as we wish it to be? Jerusalem wasn't just a city on these maps, it was the beating heart of creation itself. Picture a medieval scholar unrolling a parchment, his finger tracing the world's surface until it landed on that sacred dot, encircled like a jewel. To modern eyes, this might seem like a cartographic quirk, but to the people of the Middle Ages, it was a truth as solid as the ground beneath their feet. The earth didn't spin around the sun in their understanding. It revolved around Jerusalem, the stage where humanity's salvation had unfolded. This wasn't about measuring miles, it was about mapping meaning. The Hereford mappaemundi makes this vision breathtakingly clear. At the very center, Jerusalem sits beneath the outstretched arms of Christ, who looms over the world like a divine architect. Rivers radiate outward like spokes on a wheel, mirroring the 4 rivers of Eden described in Genesis. Every continent bends toward this focal point: Europe, Africa, and Asia, distorted like reflections in a curved mirror. Distances shrink or stretch based on their spiritual significance, not their physical reality. Rome might appear closer to Jerusalem than it actually is, while vast stretches of Asia collapse into cramped margins. The map wasn't lying, it was preaching. This symbolic geography had real-world consequences. Pilgrims planning journeys to the Holy Land would consult maps that made Jerusalem seem tantalizingly accessible, its centrality compressing the perceived hardships of travel. Crusaders, too, marched under banners embroidered with maps that placed their sacred goal at the world's core, reinforcing the righteousness of their cause. Even trade routes bent to this logic, with merchants navigating not just by coastlines but by the pull of holy cities along the way. The map's distortion wasn't an accident, it was a compass pointing toward salvation. But what happened when this vision collided with the wider world? As travelers brought back accounts of distant lands, cracks began to show in the tidy, Jerusalem-centered model. Marco Polo's descriptions of China's sprawling cities didn't fit neatly into a world where everything orbited a single holy site. Arab geographers, working from precise astronomical calculations, drew maps with entirely different centers of gravity. Yet for centuries, European cartographers clung to the old symbols, layering new discoveries onto the familiar framework. It was as if admitting Jerusalem wasn't the geographical heart would unravel something deeper, a cosmic order that gave their world meaning. That tension between faith and fact reveals something profound about how maps shape our reality. Today, we might smirk at the idea of a city dictating the layout of continents, but don't we still center our own worldviews in subtle ways? Modern maps place the prime meridian at Greenwich, not because it's a geographical inevitability, but because a room full of diplomats decided it so in 1884. Every map, no matter how scientific, carries the fingerprints of the culture that made it. The medieval cartographers just wore their hearts and their holy city on their parchment. The 3-continent model wasn't just a simplification, it was a world view carved into parchment. Imagine a map shaped like the letter T, its strokes dividing the Earth into Europe, Asia, and Africa, with a vast ocean encircling them like a moat. At the intersection of those lines, Jerusalem, of course, anchoring the design both spiritually and symbolically. These so-called TO maps were less about navigation and more about order, a way to tidy the chaos of creation into something a medieval mind could grasp. But this tidy division came with blind spots so vast they could hide entire continents. Asia, stretching across the top of the T, often dwarfed the other lands, its edges fading into realms of legend like the kingdom of Gog and Magog, where Alexander the Great was said to have trapped monstrous tribes behind iron gates. Africa, the right leg of the T, tapered into mystery. Its southern tip either vanished into the encircling ocean or bristled with warnings. Here be dragons, or worse, the scorched land where the sun burned the earth black. Europe, cozy in its left leg position, was drawn with familiar coastlines, as if the cartographers sighed in relief when they reached a place they recognized. The Americas, Australia, unimaginable, the Pacific Ocean, a blank space that might as well have been the edge of the world. This wasn't just ignorance, it was a cage of belief. When sailors like Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator pushed south along Africa's coast in the 1400s, their crews whispered that the waters beyond Cape Bojador would boil under a cursed sun, or that sea monsters would drag them into the abyss. The maps had told them so. It took decades for explorers to prove those fears wrong, to realize that the world was wider, wilder, and far weirder than any TO map could contain. And yet, these mistakes held a peculiar power. The three-continent model wasn't just a geographic flub. It was a story Europe told itself about its place in creation. To admit unknown lands existed would have shaken the foundations of that story, something far scarier than any sea monster. So when Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't think he'd found a new world. He died insisting it was Asia because the alternative would have shattered the map he'd trusted his whole life. That's the irony. The very charts meant to guide explorers also blinded them. The world was always bigger than the page. It just took courage and a few wrong turns to prove it. The blank spaces on medieval maps didn't stay empty for long. They became canvases for the imagination, crowded with creatures that blurred the line between zoology and legend. Take the Blemmies, those headless warriors with faces embedded in their torsos. To modern eyes, they're pure fantasy, but medieval scholars would have cited them as fact, backed by no less than Pliny the Elder's ancient texts. These weren't just doodles in the margins, they were placeholders for the unexplainable, a way to label the terrifying gaps in human knowledge. When a map declared, "Here be dragons," it wasn't an artist's flourish, it was a warning as practical as a "do not enter" sign. But where did these myths come from? Many trace back to a game of historical telephone. Travelers returning from distant lands might describe encountering an elephant, calling it a great beast with a serpent for a nose. Through retellings, the trunk could morph into a dragon's tail, the tusks into horns. Gorillas, glimpsed briefly through jungle foliage, became hairy giants with glowing eyes. Even the Cyclops might have roots in reality. Fossilized mammoth skulls with their massive central nasal cavity could easily be mistaken for a single, gaping eye socket. The irony, these monsters were often just misunderstood neighbors, their true nature lost in translation across continents and centuries. The psychological power of these creatures can't be overstated. They didn't just fill space, they policed it. For a sailor eyeing the horizon beyond known waters, the threat of sea serpents coiled in the waves was as real as any storm. Scholars like St. Augustine argued that such beings proved God's boundless creativity, while rulers weaponized the myths to control exploration. Why risk lives and treasure sailing west when the edges of the map promised only chaos? This fear had consequences. It delayed the discovery of new trade routes, kept cultures isolated, and left entire continents hidden in plain sight. Yet the persistence of these legends reveals something unexpected about human curiosity. For every cartographer who drew dragons to scare people away, there was an explorer like Marco Polo, who documented unicorns, likely rhinos with meticulous detail, or Sir John Mandeville, whose travelogue mixed genuine observations with tales of men who turned into wolves under the full moon. Even as the age of exploration dawned, monsters clung to maps like shadows at the edges of a campfire's light. Columbus's crew swore they saw mermaids, probably manatees, in the Caribbean. Magellan's chronicler wrote of Patagonian giants so tall, the Europeans barely reached their waists. The truth is, we've always needed monsters. They're the price of admission to the unknown, the guardians of the last blank spaces on our mental maps. Today, we've swapped dragons for dark matter and sea serpents for quantum uncertainty, but the impulse remains the same, to name the things we don't yet understand, even if we must invent them first. And that's the real magic of these medieval myths. They remind us that every era has its edges, its own terra incognita waiting to be redrawn. The myths of Greece and Rome didn't just survive the fall of empires, they wormed their way onto parchment, transforming medieval maps into collages of legend and geography. Picture a cartographer hunched over his work, quill in hand, copying coordinates from Ptolemy's ancient texts, while sprinkling in Hercules' labors or Jason's voyage among the stars. These weren't decorative touches, they were cultural DNA, stitching the classical world's imagination onto the medieval mind. When a map placed the Garden of Eden at the edge of Asia, complete with 4 rivers flowing from its soil, it wasn't just marking a location, it was preserving a 2,000-year-old dream of paradise. Take Alexander the Great's gates, a legend that refused to die. Ancient historians like Josephus claimed the Macedonian king built a massive barrier to trap the savage tribes of Gog and Magog, a story that morphed over centuries. By the Middle Ages, maps from England to Persia showed these gates lurking beyond the Caucasus Mountains, holding back apocalyptic hordes. Crusaders marching east scanned the horizon for them. Mongol invaders were briefly mistaken for the very tribes Alexander was said to have imprisoned. The myth was so persistent that when Spanish explorers reached the Darien Gap in Panama, some swore they'd found the gates at last. Then there was Prester John, the Phantom King, who haunted maps for 500 years. A forged letter in the 1200s claimed this Christian ruler governed a utopia in the east, full of pepper forests and fountains of youth. Popes sent envoys to find him. Portuguese sailors scoured Africa hoping his kingdom lay beyond the Sahara. Even as late as the 1500s, maps stubbornly placed his realm in Ethiopia or India, despite mounting evidence he'd never existed. The cost of this fantasy. Countless expeditions drained of resources, lives lost chasing a mirage woven from equal parts hope and hearsay. But perhaps no myth warped geography more than the terror of the Atlantic. Roman poets like Virgil had described it as a sea of shadows, and medieval scholars amplified the dread. Maps labeled its waters as Mare Tenebrosum, the dark sea, where leviathans lurked and ships who ventured too far would slide off the edge of the world. These warnings weren't mere superstition, they were deterrents. For centuries, sailors hugged coastlines, terrified of open oceans. When Portuguese explorers finally pushed past Cape Bojador in the 1420s, their crews wept with relief at discovering the Atlantic was in fact navigable. What's striking isn't that these myths endured, it's how fiercely they were defended. When new knowledge clashed with old tales, the tales often won. A scholar might dismiss reports of mermaids as manatees, but still insist the Earth was too small to contain unknown continents. A navigator could cross an ocean and return with proof, only to have his findings bent to fit ancient frameworks. The past wasn't just prologue, it was a straitjacket stitched from threads of Homer and Pliny and Scripture. Yet in their stubbornness, these myths reveal a truth about human nature. We don't just map the world, we map our hopes onto it. The Garden of Eden wasn't a place, it was a longing for innocence. Prester John wasn't a king, he was the fantasy of a Christian ally in a hostile world. Even the Atlantic's monsters were manifestations of a deeper fear, the terror of the unknown. The irony, by clinging to these stories, medieval Europe delayed discoveries that would shatter them. But that's the paradox of progress. Sometimes you have to sail straight into the dark to prove the monsters were never there at all. The church didn't just influence medieval maps, it held the pen. In an era where literacy was rare and books were treasures locked in monastery libraries, cartographers weren't free agents sketching coastlines for the sake of accuracy. They were scribes of a sacred story, answerable to bishops and abbots who saw the earth as a divine canvas. Imagine a world where every map had to pass theological scrutiny, where a misplaced continent could be heresy. This wasn't just oversight, it was a wholesale fusion of faith and geography. Consider the case of the Venerable Bede, an 8th century monk whose writings on the spherical earth drew from ancient Greek science. His work survived barely because he framed it as proof of God's orderly creation. But other scholars weren't so lucky. When the Spanish bishop Isidore of Seville compiled his encyclopedic Etymologies in the 6th century, he dismissed the Earth's curvature as pagan nonsense, insisting it was flat like a wheel. His version became doctrine, etched into maps for centuries. The irony, even St. Augustine, centuries earlier, had acknowledged the Earth was round, but his nuance was lost in the Church's push for doctrinal simplicity. The Bible didn't just inspire these maps, it dictated their structure. Take the TO maps dividing the world among Noah's sons. Shem got Asia, Japheth Europe, and Ham Africa, a division that conveniently mirrored medieval racial hierarchies. Jerusalem's centrality wasn't just symbolic, it was scriptural, reinforcing the idea that history unfolded along a divine axis, and woe to the cartographer who dared suggest otherwise. When the Catalan Atlas of the 1400s included Muslim trading hubs like Timbuktu with startling accuracy, it had to cloak them in Christian iconography to avoid accusations of heresy. Yet cracks in this system were inevitable. As merchant ships ventured farther, their pilots' charts, crude, practical things drawn on sheepskin, began diverging from the Church's master narrative. A Genoese sailor might note a coastline's true curve, or a Venetian trader record the actual distance to Alexandria. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were necessities of survival. Slowly, the weight of lived experience pressed against dogma. By the time Marco Polo returned from Asia with tales that contradicted the maps, the Church faced a dilemma: cling to tradition or adapt. The tension between faith and fact wasn't just academic. It delayed the age of exploration by decades. When Portuguese navigators like Prince Henry sought funding to sail beyond known waters, they faced clerics who quoted psalms declaring, "The earth is established, it shall not be moved." Columbus himself, armed with maps that underestimated the globe's size by thousands of miles, nearly lost his crew to mutiny because the Church's geography had taught them to expect monsters, not continents. What's remarkable isn't that the Church controlled map-making, it's how long that control lasted. Even as late as the 1500s, when Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator was crafting his revolutionary world projections, he still felt compelled to label unexplored southern lands as Terra Australis Incognita, a biblical echo of the unknown. The maps had changed, but their shadow lingered. This collision of faith and geography left an indelible mark. Today's satellite images may show an objective Earth, but the medieval struggle reminds us, every map is a battleground of ideas. The Church's maps weren't lies, they were arguments about power, about truth, about who gets to define the shape of the world. And in their fading ink, we see the birth pangs of modernity, the moment when the weight of evidence began to outweigh the weight of authority. Trade routes didn't just move silks and spices, they smuggled truth into the medieval worldview, one merchant's logbook at a time. Picture a Genos galley captain unfurling a portolan chart, its parchment crisscrossed with precise room lines radiating like spider silk. These weren't spiritual diagrams, they were tools of survival where a single misplaced island could mean shipwreck. Sailors needed accuracy, not allegory, and their maps delivered, coastlines etched with startling detail, ports marked by careful observation rather than ancient texts. The contrast couldn't be starker. While monks in scriptoriums drew dragons at the edges of mappaemundi, pilots were sketching headlands and harbors so accurately that some portolans remain navigable even today. The Silk Road played a quiet revolution in this story. As caravans trudged from Venice to Beijing, merchants recorded real distances, real mountains, real rivers, details that trickled back to Europe in letters and ledgers. Marco Polo's account of Cathay's sprawling cities didn't just entertain readers, it shattered the cramped Asia of TO maps, revealing a continent vaster than theologians had dreamed. Yet old habits died hard. Cartographers often grafted these new facts onto old frameworks, like grafting a modern street map onto a stained glass window. The Catalan Atlas of 1375 is a perfect hybrid, African gold routes drawn with traders' precision, yet the Indian Ocean still swarms with mythic islands from antiquity. This duality, sacred versus secular geography, wasn't just academic. It shaped empires. When Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator funded voyages down Africa's coast, his pilots relied on portolans that ignored the church's insistence on an unnavigable torrid zone. Their success didn't just open new trade routes, it proved that lived experience could trump dogma. Yet even as Henry's caravels rounded Cape Bojador, scholars in Lisbon still debated whether the Earth's southern reaches were inhabited, or if they were the scorched domain of biblical giants. The real surprise, how long these parallel truths coexisted. A 15th-century merchant might consult a portolan to sail to Alexandria, then return home to a cathedral displaying a mappaemundi where the same city sat dwarfed by illustrations of the Last Judgment. The world was splitting in two, one measurable, the other mystical, and in that tension lay the seeds of revolution. As traders' maps grew more detailed, they exposed the cracks in ancient knowledge, quietly preparing the way for Columbus's gamble and Mercator's grids. The age of exploration wasn't born in castles or cloisters, it was charted in the ink-stained hands of those who dared to map what they saw, not what they were told to believe. The Crusades didn't just clash swords, they collided worldviews. When European knights marched into the Middle East, they expected to reclaim holy lands, not to stumble into libraries overflowing with knowledge their own universities couldn't match. Arab cartographers like Al-Idrisi had already mapped the world with stunning precision, using astronomical calculations and accounts from traders who'd crossed the Indian Ocean. Their maps didn't center on Jerusalem, they spun on mathematical axes, with coastlines sketched from actual voyages, not scripture. For crusaders raised on mappaemundi, where dragons outnumbered cities, these charts must have felt like discovering an entirely new planet. Yet the most surprising thing, how little changed. Returning knights brought back fragments of this knowledge, a trader's sketch of the Nile's true course, a stolen Arabic star chart, but Europe's mapmakers often shrugged. The church dismissed Arab science as pagan trickery, and scholars clung to Ptolemy's ancient texts even when fresh evidence proved them wrong. It wasn't ignorance, it was distrust. To admit that the infidel knew more about God's creation was unthinkable. So while a handful of thinkers like Roger Bacon dared to cite Arabic sources, most maps stayed stubbornly symbolic, their errors fossilized by faith. The irony, the Crusades reinforced the very myths they could have shattered. pilgrims returning from Jerusalem swore its streets gleamed with divine light, cementing its place at the heart of maps, never mind that Arab geographers had long since proven the city wasn't the world's geographic midpoint. Crusader chronicles overflowed with tales of marvels seen en route, from the footprints of giants in Anatolia to the rivers of paradise in Mesopotamia, all of which seeped back into European atlases as facts. The more Europeans ventured outward, the tighter they clung to the old stories, as if the weight of tradition could keep the world from spinning off its sacred axis. But change was creeping in, carried not by knights but by merchants. Italian traders, less concerned with theology than profit, began smuggling Arab maps into port cities like Venice and Genoa. These weren't displayed in cathedrals, they were tucked into counting houses, guiding ships to spice markets and silk roads. Slowly, the edges of the medieval map began to fray. A merchant's chart might still show Jerusalem glowing at the center, but its margins now included accurate sketches of the Black Sea or the Nile Delta, details copied from Arabic originals. It was a quiet revolution, geography bending to the demands of commerce, not creed. Then came the Mongols. Just as Europe was digesting these fragments of Arab knowledge, the steppe horsemen exploded across Asia, ripping open the Silk Road like a knife through parchment. Their conquests didn't just reshape empires, they forced the West to redraw its maps all over again. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer territory, it shattered mental barriers. When Genghis Khan's horsemen unified Eurasia under the Pax Mongolica in the 13th century, they didn't just create history's largest land empire, they stitched together a continent that had been fragmented by fear and folklore. For the first time, a Venetian merchant could ride from the Black Sea to Beijing without fearing bandits or borders, his saddlebags stuffed with goods and something far more precious, knowledge. The Mongols themselves cared little for mapmaking, but their ruthless efficiency at securing trade routes accidentally gifted Europe a revelation. The world was far bigger and far stranger than its maps had ever allowed. Enter Marco Polo, whose 24-year journey through Mongol-ruled Asia reads like a medieval travel vlog. His descriptions of Chinese cities like Hangzhou with its paved streets, bustling canals, and a population dwarfing any European capital should have rewritten every atlas on the continent. Yet when Polo returned home, few believed him. His account of paper money, a concept as alien to Europeans as smartphones to the Romans, was mocked as fantasy. Even his nickname, Marco of the Millions, carried a sneer, as if the sheer scale of what he'd witnessed could only be exaggeration. The problem wasn't that Polo lied, it was that the truth didn't fit the maps. Medieval Europe's cartographic crisis wasn't just about missing details. It was a clash of epistemologies. Polo's reports of Asian deserts wider than entire kingdoms or ports where 1,000 ships docked daily didn't align with TO maps, where Asia was a cramped upper quadrant dotted with biblical landmarks. Scholars faced a choice: admit their geography was hopelessly outdated or dismiss Polo as a fabulist. Many chose the latter. When cartographers did grudgingly adjust their work, they often distorted Polo's facts to fit old frameworks, flattening the curvature of the earth to squeeze in his descriptions, or relocating the mythical Prester John to newly revealed territories. Yet the Mongol impact went deeper than any single traveler's tale. Persian scholars in Mongol courts compiled world maps incorporating Chinese, Arab, and European knowledge, some of which trickled west via Jewish traders and renegade monks. These hybrid charts showed a Eurasia that was round, interconnected, and staggeringly vast, with accurate placements of the Caspian Sea and the Himalayan foothills. But here's the twist: even as this flood of new data reached Europe, it often drowned in dogma. A 14th century monk redrawing a mappaemundi might add Cathay, as Polo described it, but still surrounded with Gog and Magog's lurking hordes or the gates of Alexander. Old myths clung like burrs, resisting the winds of change. The real tragedy, this resistance had consequences. When Columbus set sail 2 centuries later, he carried maps that still underestimated Earth's size by thousands of miles, partly because Europe had spent generations dismissing the full scope of Mongol-era reports. Had Polo's accounts been taken seriously, had the sheer breadth of Asia been properly measured, the discovery of the Americas might have unfolded very differently. But maps, like mines, are hard to redraw. The Mongols had torn open the world, but it would take the Renaissance, with its rediscovery of Ptolemy's lost texts and its hunger for empirical proof, to finally stitch together a geography that matched reality. Until then, the old parchments held sway, their edges curling protectively around a world that no longer existed. Medieval maps didn't just misplace continents, they turned climate into a cage. Stare at one of these charts long enough, and you'd swear the equator was a ring of fire, the Arctic a wall of ice, and the lands between the only places fit for human feet. The so-called torrid zone wasn't just hot on these maps. It was a biblical furnace, a scorched no-man's land where the sun hung directly overhead, boiling seas and cracking soil. Ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle had theorized it, medieval scholars like Isidore of Seville canonized it, and by the time it reached the maps, it was gospel. Cross this line and you'd melt like wax. The irony, this myth wasn't just wrong, it was self-fulfilling. Because no European sailor dared venture south of the Sahara for centuries, the torrid zone remained blank, its emptiness proving the ancients right. Arab traders who'd been crossing the equator for generations knew better. Their maps showed thriving gold mines in Mali and bustling ports in Zanzibar, but their knowledge rarely made it into European atlases. Fear filled the gaps instead. On the Hereford mappaemundi, Africa's southern half dissolves into a wasteland labeled terra incognita, its edges crawling with monstrous races cooked up by overheated imaginations. Then came the Portuguese. In the 1420s, Prince Henry the Navigator's ships began inching down Africa's west coast. Their crews braced for the moment the waters would boil and the sails ignite. But when they crossed the Canary Islands, then the Cape Verde archipelago, and kept going, something astonishing happened. Nothing. The sea stayed cool, the air breathable. By 1444, when Dinnie's Dyers rounded Cape Verde well south of the supposed torrid zone, the myth began to crumble. The Portuguese didn't just find habitable land, they found forests dripping with fruit, rivers teeming with fish, and kingdoms whose wealth would soon flood Europe. The torrid zone wasn't a barrier, it was a gateway. Meanwhile, at the opposite edge of the world, another climate myth froze progress in its tracks. Medieval maps often showed the Arctic as a concentric ring of icy cliffs, guarded by giants straight out of Norse sagas. Some scholars, citing lost Roman texts, claimed the far north was a frozen sea where the ocean hardened into congealed breath. These weren't just stories, they were deterrents. When the Vikings established settlements in Greenland and briefly reached North America, their sagas described these lands as habitable, yet mainstream European cartography ignored them for centuries, preferring the safer fiction of an impassable frozen rim. The cost of these climate myths staggering. Imagine how exploration might have accelerated if navigators hadn't been taught that half the world was either on fire or locked in ice. Portuguese breakthrough proved that reality rarely matches legend, but old fears die hard. Even after Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, some maps still labeled the Indian Ocean as a closed sea, unable to shake Ptolemy's ancient era. What finally broke the spell? Technology, and the stubborn minds who wielded it. The astrolabe, borrowed from Arab navigators, let sailors measure the sun's angle at different latitudes, proving the equator wasn't a death trap. The magnetic compass, once a curiosity, revealed that the Arctic wasn't a wall but a direction. Slowly, the world stretched open, its climate zones shifting from myth to measurement. But that transformation didn't happen on parchment first. It happened in the hearts of sailors who dared to sail past the edges of their maps into the places their teachers had sworn were never meant for men. The astrolabe wasn't just a tool, it was a revolution disguised as brass. Picture a ship's captain standing on deck at dusk, holding this intricate disc up to the fading light, aligning its pierced plates with the North Star to calculate his latitude. For centuries, sailors had hugged coastlines, navigating by landmarks and guesswork. But with the astrolabe, borrowed from Arab scholars who'd refined it over generations, they could suddenly measure their place on Earth with mathematical precision. No longer at the mercy of myths about boiling seas or edge-of-the-world monsters, they could strike out into the open ocean with something medieval Europe had rarely trusted before: confidence. Yet this newfound accuracy exposed an awkward truth. While sailors were plotting courses using stars and compasses, the maps they carried still bulged with ancient errors. A captain might take a reading showing he was at 20 degrees north latitude, only to consult his chart and find the coastline drawn 50 miles off its true position. The disconnect wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. Pilots began scribbling corrections in the margins of their portalans, creating a messy collision of old beliefs and new data. The compass deepened this divide, originally dismissed by some clerics as demonic for its uncanny ability to point north regardless of weather. This humble magnetized needle became the silent rebel of medieval navigation. Unlike the symbolic TO maps, which placed east at the top where paradise supposedly lay, the compass cared nothing for theology. It obeyed Earth's magnetic field alone, pulling sailors toward a very different kind of truth. And so, a quiet rift opened between those who mapped the world and those who moved through it. Scholars in universities might still argue over Ptolemy's ancient coordinates, but aboard ships like those of Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias, crews were stitching together their own geography, one latitude reading at a time. When Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he didn't just prove Africa could be circumnavigated. He proved that the old maps, with their enclosed oceans and impassable tropics, were obsolete. The irony, this technological leap didn't immediately redraw the world. Cartographers, often monks with little seafaring experience, were slow to abandon the familiar frameworks of their predecessors. Even as late as Columbus's first voyage, some charts still showed Japan lurking temptingly close to Europe's western edge, a miscalculation that may have emboldened his fateful gamble. The tools had outpaced the texts, leaving explorers suspended between two worldviews, one measured in degrees and declinations, the other in dragons and dogma. What finally bridged the gap? The sheer weight of evidence. As more ships returned with logs full of corrected latitudes and revised coastlines, the pressure to update maps became irresistible. By the time Mercator crafted his famous projection in the 1500s, the age of symbolic geography was waning. The astrolabe and compass hadn't just changed navigation, they'd rewritten the rules of knowledge itself, proving that the world could be measured, not just imagined. And in that shift lay the seeds of modernity, a faith not in ancient authorities but in the unflinching needle of a compass, the cold calculus of the stars. The phantom islands of medieval maps weren't just harmless fictions, they were traps lying in wait for unsuspecting explorers. Take St. Brendan's Island, a verdant paradise supposedly discovered by a 6th century Irish monk during his legendary sea voyage. For 800 years, cartographers kept drawing it west of the Canary Islands, despite no one ever finding it. Sailors swore they glimpsed its misty shores, only to watch them vanish as their ships drew near. The island became a nautical mirage, luring expeditions like that of Portuguese navigator Diogo de Tive in 1452, who wasted months searching before conceding defeat. Yet maps continued to feature it well into the 1700s, a testament to the stubborn power of myth. Then there was High Brassel, the enchanted isle cloaked in fog, said to appear only once every 7 years. Irish lore described it as a realm of advanced civilizations, bathed in eternal sunlight. When Venetian explorer John Cabot set sail in 1497, his logs mention scouting for High Brassel alongside his search for the New World. Even the meticulous cartographer Gerardus Mercator included it on his 1569 world map, nestled southwest of Ireland. The cost of these illusions wasn't just wasted time, it was lives. English captain John Narborough lost ships and men in 1674 chasing High Brassel's coordinates, only to find empty ocean. The roots of these phantom islands reveal a collision of sources. Some, like Thule, first mentioned by the Greek explorer Pytheas in the 4th century BCE, were ancient legends repurposed by medieval scholars. Others sprang from optical illusions, banks of fog mistaken for land, or icebergs misread as mountainous shores. The infamous Isle of Demons off Canada's coast, where sailors reported hearing shrieks in the wind, likely originated from howling walrus colonies. But once these places were inked onto vellum, they took on a life of their own. Mapmakers copied them from one chart to the next, their existence affirmed by the weight of tradition rather than evidence. The consequences rippled far beyond parchment. Columbus carried maps showing Antillia, a phantom archipelago west of Portugal, which may have fueled his belief that Asia lay closer than it did. Spanish explorers later conflated Antillia with the real Caribbean islands, leaving us with the modern name Antilles. Even the otherwise pragmatic Portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors included fictional islands like Satanas, a cursed land supposedly inhabited by demons, right alongside accurate ports. These weren't just decorative, they shaped navigation. A captain might alter his course to avoid a non-existent hazard or waste precious supplies hunting for an island that existed only in a monk's marginalia. What's striking isn't that these errors persisted, it's how desperately people clung to them. When French expeditions failed to find the Isle of St. Borondon near the Canaries in the 1720s, locals insisted it was invisible, not imaginary. The line between myth and map had blurred beyond recognition, and in that blur we see the birth pangs of modern cartography, the moment when the world, once drawn from stories, had to be redrawn from observation. The ghost islands didn't fade quietly. They sank beneath the waves of progress, one stubborn coordinate at a time. Christopher Columbus didn't just sail into the unknown. He sailed straight into a medieval miscalculation that would alter history. Armed with maps that squeezed Asia into a fraction of its true size and texts that dismissed the vast Pacific Ocean as a narrow moat, he became the most famous victim of geography's stubborn errors. His journey wasn't just a gamble on the wind, it was a bet placed on centuries of flawed calculations. When he landed in the Caribbean in 1492, his unshakable confidence came from a simple, staggering mistake. He believed Japan lay just 3,000 miles west of the Canary Islands. The real distance was over 12,000. The roots of this error stretch back to a 9th century mistranslation. Arab geographer Al-Khwarizmi had calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, but when his work reached Europe, scholars like Roger Bacon misread the units, shrinking the planet by nearly a quarter. Columbus, poring over these texts in Lisbon, found exactly what he wanted: proof that his audacious plan was feasible. Even when experts like the King of Portugal's navigators warned him the true distance was far greater, he dismissed them. The medieval maps on his side showed Cipangu, Japan, floating temptingly close to Europe's western edge, and he clung to that fantasy like a lifeline. The consequences of this delusion were profound. Had Columbus known the real scale of the globe, he might never have set sail, or at least stocked more supplies for the grueling Pacific crossing that actually awaited him. Instead, his accidental encounter with the Americas set off a chain reaction. The Columbian Exchange, the transatlantic slave trade, the rise of European empires. All because a handful of misread numbers and mythical islands refused to fade from the maps. But here's the twist: Columbus wasn't the only one fooled. For years after his return, many cartographers stubbornly labeled the Caribbean islands as the Indies, squeezing them into Asia's eastern fringe. It wasn't willful ignorance, it was the agony of letting go. Admitting these lands were new continents would have shattered the tidy three-part world of medieval geography, forcing a reckoning with how little Europe truly knew. The resistance to change reached absurd heights. When Amerigo Vespucci proposed these lands were a new world in 1501, scholars attacked him for contradicting ancient authorities. One prominent cartographer insisted the Americas were actually the biblical land of Ophir, home to King Solomon's mines. Even as late as 1530, some maps still showed North America as a thin peninsula dangling from China. The past, it seemed, was harder to unlearn than the unknown was to explore. Columbus's story isn't just about one man's error. It's about how knowledge, once fossilized on parchment, can steer history down unintended paths. Those medieval miscalculations didn't just mislead explorers, they redirected the flow of cultures, species, and power across continents. And when the truth finally broke through, it didn't come from a mapmaker's pen. It came from sailors' logs, indigenous guides, and the slow, stubborn weight of reality pressing against the page. The rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography in the early 1500s wasn't just a scholarly event, it was a seismic shift that cracked open the medieval worldview. After centuries of maps dominated by symbolism and scripture, here was a 2nd century Greek treatise that treated the Earth as a measurable, mathematical space. Ptolemy's grids of latitude and longitude, his meticulous coordinates for cities from Alexandria to the Silk Road, offered Renaissance scholars something revolutionary: a system. Suddenly, the world could be plotted like a chessboard, its pieces moved by logic rather than legend. Yet for all its brilliance, Ptolemy's work came with its own blind spots, errors that would stubbornly cling to maps for generations. His most consequential mistake, enclosing the Indian Ocean as a giant lake with Africa curving eastward to meet Asia. This single flaw warped exploration for decades. When Portuguese navigators like Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, they weren't just finding a new route to India, they were proving a 1500-year-old theory wrong. The ocean wasn't landlocked at all, it was a gateway to vast, uncharted waters. The irony of Ptolemy's revival lies in how his science became dogma. Renaissance scholars, hungry for ancient wisdom, treated his coordinates as gospel. When German cartographer Martin Wald-Seemuller crafted his groundbreaking world map in 1507, he blended Ptolemy's grids with new explorer data, but still left Africa attached to Asia, a ghostly echo of the old era. Even as late as 1538, maps like those of Gerardus Mercator showed a sliver of land tenuously linking southern Africa to a phantom, Terra Australis, because Ptolemy's framework demanded it. The past, it seemed, was a stubborn collaborator, but Ptolemy's legacy wasn't just about mistakes. His real gift was the grid itself, a language of lines that allowed cartographers to argue in numbers, not myths. For the first time, two scholars on opposite sides of Europe could debate a coastline's shape using shared coordinates. This precision birthed a new kind of mapmaker, part mathematician, part artist, willing to correct the ancients when the evidence demanded it. By the 1540s, Portuguese atlases were quietly redrawing Africa's southern tip, shearing off Ptolemy's fictional land bridge. The grid had become a scaffold, not a cage. Then came the printing press, poised to amplify both the brilliance and the blunders of this cartographic revolution. The printing press didn't just spread knowledge, it set mistakes in stone. Imagine a single cartographer's slip of the pen in Lisbon or Venice, now duplicated 1,000 times over, inked onto fresh parchment and shipped to every corner of Europe. Errors that might have faded into obscurity in the age of hand-copied manuscripts suddenly gained immortality. Take the infamous Dragon's Tail, a phantom peninsula jutting from Southeast Asia that haunted maps from the 1400s well into the 1600s. What began as a misinterpretation of Marco Polo's accounts, or perhaps a smudged line on an early Portolan chart, became gospel once the presses started rolling. No matter how many sailors returned from the region insisting the landmass didn't exist, the myth persisted. Its paper claws sunk deep into the geographic imagination of an entire continent. This was the double-edged sword of the printing revolution. For the first time, maps could reach merchants, scholars, and explorers in unprecedented numbers, democratizing access to geographic knowledge. But with that reach came rigidity. A correction couldn't simply be whispered among monks in a scriptorium. It had to outcompete stacks of already printed atlases. The German cartographer Sebastian Münster learned this the hard way when his influential Cosmographia accidentally swapped the labels for Africa and Asia in one edition, a blunder that spawned knockoffs for decades. Even when explorers like Ferdinand Magellan charted the strait that now bears his name, some printed maps still showed South America welded to a vast southern continent because Ptolemy's ancient template was too entrenched to discard. The cost of these frozen errors wasn't just academic. Ships veered off course chasing phantom islands like High Brassel, their crews starving as they scoured empty seas. Colonists planted flags on lands that maps promised were rich with gold, only to find swamps or hostile terrain. And the deeper irony, the very technology that could have sped up corrections, the printing press often slowed them down. Printers, wary of scrapping expensive copper plates, would simply tweak outdated maps with minor updates rather than start from scratch. A single plate might go through a dozen revisions, each one layering fresh inaccuracies over old ones like geological strata of misinformation. Yet amid this chaos, a new kind of mapmaker emerged. Figures like Gerardus Mercator didn't just copy old charts, they cross-referenced them with sailors' logs, celestial observations, and critically, each other's work. The printing press, for all its flaws, had created something unprecedented, a networked community of geographers who could build on shared data. Slowly, painstakingly, the world began to snap into focus. But that story belongs to the next chapter, one where ink and ambition finally outran the ghosts of medieval miscalculation. The Fra Mauro map didn't just redraw coastlines, it redrew the boundaries of thought itself. Created in 1459 by a Venetian monk working in the quiet cloisters of his island monastery, this 6-foot-wide masterpiece was a cartographic chimera, part medieval allegory, part cutting-edge science. At first glance, it still carries echoes of the old world. Jerusalem sits near the center, and the Garden of Eden lingers at the edge of Asia like a half-remembered dream. But look closer and something revolutionary emerges. Africa, long depicted as a stump sealed off by scorching deserts, now stretches southward with an open coastline, its tip tapering into empty ocean. Fra Mauro had done the unthinkable. He'd declared the continent circumnavigable, a full generation before Portuguese ships would prove him right. What made this map different? Fra Mauro didn't work in isolation. Venetian merchants, their ships returning from Alexandria and Constantinople, brought Arabic sailing charts packed with accurate coastal profiles. Persian traders shared accounts of Indian Ocean monsoons. Even the Chinese voyages of Admiral Zheng, he left traces in the map's careful rendering of Southeast Asia. For the first time, a European cartographer had stitched together a global vision not from ancient texts or scripture, but from the living, breathing knowledge of sailors and scholars across 3 continents. The result was a quiet rebellion. Ptolemy's enclosed Indian Ocean gone, the monstrous races lurking beyond the known world, reduced to a handful of discrete vignettes. Even the map's orientation broke tradition. South perched at the top, a nod to Arab cartographic conventions that unsettled European viewers, yet the old world refused to fade entirely. Noah's Ark still perches atop Armenia's mountains, and the Tower of Babel rises near Babylon, its bricks and mortar drawn as meticulously as any real city. This duality is what makes the Fra Mauro map so captivating. It's a snapshot of a moment when 2 worldviews coexisted, one foot planted in the symbolic geography of medieval Christendom, the other stepping boldly toward empiricism. When Fra Mauro wrote in the margins that he'd omitted certain details so as not to detract from the truth, it wasn't just a disclaimer, it was a manifesto. The map's legacy lies in its contradictions. Commissioned by King Afonso V of Portugal, it likely influenced the very explorers who would render it obsolete. Bartolomeu Dias, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, may have studied copies circulating in Lisbon's courts, but the real triumph wasn't just in predicting geographic facts, it was in proving that knowledge could cross cultural borders. Arab astrolabes, Chinese compasses, Venetian portolans, and yes, even biblical stories all found a place on Fra Mauro's parchment. In that crowded harmony, we see the first glimmers of a new idea, that the world wasn't a puzzle to be solved by ancient authorities, but a mosaic to be assembled from countless fragments of lived experience. By the time the next generation of cartographers picked up their pens, the old monsters and mythic gates would retreat to the margins, then vanish altogether. But the Fra Mauro map reminds us that revolutions rarely happen overnight. Sometimes they unfold slowly, in the careful hand of a monk who dared to listen to the world beyond his monastery walls, and in doing so, helped redraw the boundaries of the possible. The Age of Discovery didn't just shatter medieval maps, it shattered the very way humans saw their place in the cosmos. When Ferdinand Magellan's surviving crew limped back to Spain in 1522 after circumnavigating the globe, they carried more than just spices and sun-bleached logs. They brought proof that the world was vaster, weirder, and far more interconnected than any TO map had ever allowed. Oceans weren't barriers but highways, and those blank spaces once labeled "Here be dragons" were now bustling ports and fertile coastlines. Yet for all these breakthroughs, the old myths refused to die quietly. They clung to the edges of new maps like shadows at dusk, whispering that not all mysteries had been solved. Take the Cantino planisphere of 1502, a smuggled Portuguese treasure that captured this tension perfectly. On one hand, it's breathtakingly modern, the first European map to show Brazil's coastline with startling accuracy, its contours drawn from Pedro Álvares Cabral's recent landing. But look closer, and the ghosts of medieval geography still lurk. Phantom islands like Antillia float in the Atlantic, their presence unchallenged despite no sailor ever finding them. The Indian Ocean, though no longer enclosed by Africa, still hints at Ptolemy's old land bridge with faint, hesitant lines. It's as if the cartographers couldn't quite bring themselves to fully abandon the world they'd been taught to believe in. This push and pull between discovery and dogma played out in real time across Europe's workshops. When Vasco da Gama returned from India in 1499 with detailed charts of the Malabar coast, mapmakers faced a dilemma: trust the sailors' scribbled bearings or defer to Ptolemy's 1500-year-old coordinates. Some, like the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, chose compromise. His groundbreaking 1507 world map embraced the New World, even naming it America after Amerigo Vespucci, but still squeezed Asia into a distorted, shrunken shape that flattered ancient texts. Others weren't so diplomatic. Portuguese royal cartographer Pedro Rianel openly mocked outdated maps, scrawling corrections over them in ink that still smells sharp centuries later. The real revolution, though, wasn't just in the lines, it was in the legends. Earlier maps had filled their margins with biblical scenes and mythical beasts, but by the mid-1600s, those decorations gave way to something radical: empty space. Where once dragons had coiled, now there were only grids of latitude and longitude, waiting to be filled with hard-won data. Gerardus Mercator's 1569 projection didn't just update geography, it redefined it as a measurable, mathematical space. His famous grid lines, straight as a ship's wake, made navigation precise but also signaled a deeper shift. The world was no longer a story to be told, but a problem to be solved. Yet for all this progress, the human imagination proved harder to update than parchment. Sailors swapping tales in dockside taverns still spoke of mermaids in the Sargasso Sea or golden cities hidden in the Amazon. The Vinland map, later exposed as a forgery, preyed on this longing. Its fake Norse settlements in North America offered a comforting bridge between old myths and new lands. Even science flirted with fantasy. When Abraham Ortelius published the first modern atlas in 1570, he included a speculative southern continent labeled Terra Australis non dum cognita, not yet known but already dreamed. What finally tipped the scales? The sheer weight of evidence. As more ships returned with matching logs, as more explorers corroborated each other's claims, the old myths lost their grip. But the transition wasn't just about facts, it was about trust. For centuries, knowledge had flowed downward from ancient authorities to the present. Now it bubbled up from sailors' diaries, from indigenous guides, from the stars themselves. The map was no longer a declaration from on high, but a conversation. And like all great conversations, it began with three simple words: we were wrong. Gerardus Mercator never set out to reshape how we see the world. He just wanted sailors to stop getting lost. His 1569 map, with its neat grid of straight lines cutting across oceans at perfect right angles, was a navigator's dream. For the first time, captains could plot a course as simple as drawing a ruler straight line between 2 points and following the compass bearing without constant adjustments. But this mathematical elegance came with an invisible price tag. The farther landmasses were from the equator, the more they ballooned in size. Greenland, for instance, stretches to appear larger than Africa on a Mercator map, though in reality, Africa's landmass could swallow Greenland 14 times over. This wasn't just a harmless quirk of geometry. The Mercator projection, by exaggerating the size of Europe and North America while shrinking equatorial regions, quietly reinforced a worldview ripe for colonial exploitation. When British schoolchildren in the 1800s unfurled maps showing their tiny island dwarfing entire continents, it fed an unspoken narrative of dominance. Empires could point to their sprawling pink territories on classroom walls, oblivious to the fact that India or Nigeria were far vaster than the ink suggested. The map didn't just reflect power, it scripted it, yet the irony is delicious. Mercator, a Flemish scholar fleeing religious persecution, had no colonial agenda. His goal was purely practical, to help ships navigate an expanding world. The distortion was an unavoidable side effect of translating a spherical planet onto flat paper while preserving directional accuracy. But once those lines were inked, they took on a life of their own. Even as explorers filled in the blanks correcting the shape of South America, charting Australia's coasts, the underlying bias stayed frozen in place, reprinted in atlases for centuries. By the 1970s, critics began calling out this cartographic sleight of hand. German historian Arno Peters unveiled an alternative, equal area projection that showed continents at their true sizes, sparking fierce debate. Suddenly, Europe shrank to its actual proportions, while Africa and South America stretched wide across the page. Classroom walls became battlegrounds between competing visions of the world, one prioritizing navigation, the other justice. Airlines and weather services still rely on Mercator's math today, but digital tools like Google Earth now let us toggle between perspectives with a click, offering a planetary view no medieval monk or Renaissance scholar could have imagined. The lesson here isn't that Mercator was wrong, it's that every map is a negotiation. Medieval cartographers sacrificed accuracy for symbolism. Mercator traded proportion for practicality. Today, we grapple with digital algorithms that decide which landmarks appear on our phone screens and which fade into obscurity. The distortions have just gone underground, hiding in lines of code instead of parchment. Perhaps the real legacy of those ancient mappaemundi isn't their dragons or misplaced rivers, but their honesty about one timeless truth: no map can ever be neutral. It will always show you the world as someone once believed it should be seen. The lines we draw on maps today aren't just political statements, they're palimpsests layered over centuries of medieval assumptions that refuse to fade. Take the division between Africa and Asia, a split that feels inevitable until you trace it back to its origins. Medieval cartographers, working with patchy knowledge and biblical frameworks, often used the Nile River as the continental boundary, a choice rooted more in Ptolemy's ancient texts than geographic logic. Fast forward to the 1880s, when European powers carved up Africa with rulers and treaties in Berlin, and that arbitrary medieval division resurfaced in the borders of modern Egypt and Sudan. The Nile, once a symbolic divider on parchment, became a real-world fissure between identities, administrations, and even conflicts. This wasn't just about rivers. The medieval habit of labeling lands as civilized or barbaric seeped into the ink of imperial maps, justifying conquests from the Americas to India. TO maps had long placed Europe at the top of the hierarchy, Africa and Asia as exotic peripheries of visual rhetoric that colonizers later weaponized. When the British mapped India, they didn't just impose borders, they resurrected medieval tropes, painting vibrant cultures as chaotic, terra incognita, needing European order. The same logic justified the scramble for Africa, where arbitrary lines drawn in distant capitals ignored ethnic ties, watersheds, and histories, creating fractures that still spark tensions today. The ripple effects are startling. Consider the Congo Basin, split among 5 nations by colonial powers who cared more for resource extraction than tribal territories. Those borders, drawn with medieval-style disregard for local realities, fueled everything from civil wars to modern-day resource disputes. Even the term Middle East carries medieval baggage, a relic of Eurocentric maps that positioned the region as a halfway point between us and the distant Orient, a label that still shapes diplomatic and cultural perceptions. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is psychological. Medieval maps taught Europe to see itself as the center, a worldview that hardened into entitlement. When the Spanish and Portuguese signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the globe along a meridian, they weren't just claiming land. They were acting out a fantasy of dominion straight from mappaemundi, where unknown realms existed to be conquered and converted. That arrogance echoes in modern trade deals and military interventions, where powerful nations still draw lines as if the world is theirs to partition. Yet there's a twist in this story. Just as medieval maps were corrected by explorers willing to sail past the edges, today's borders are being redrawn not by emperors but by climate change. Rising seas are erasing colonial boundaries in the Pacific, while melting Arctic ice exposes new frontiers that medieval cartographers never dreamed of. The circle is closing. Our maps, once frozen by tradition, are fluid again, reshaped by forces as unpredictable as the winds that blew Columbus off course. The difference, this time, we're beginning to understand that every line we draw, whether on parchment or pixels, carries the weight of history and the responsibility to finally get it right. Fantasy worlds whisper with the ghosts of medieval cartography. The moment you unroll a map of Middle-earth or Westeros, you're stepping into a tradition older than parchment itself. Tolkien, a scholar steeped in ancient texts, didn't just draw continents. He sketched a mappaemundi for his age, complete with blank spaces labeled, "Here lie the wild lands of the East," and mountains that echoed the untamed edges of the Hereford map. George R.R. Martin's known world in Game of Thrones mirrors the medieval habit of compressing familiar realms into detailed cores while letting distant regions dissolve into rumor. Essos might as well be a latter-day Cathay, teeming with exotic cities and whispered horrors. These creations aren't just homages, they're proof that the medieval mind's dance between fact and fantasy still tugs at our imagination. Even our modern jokes about "here be dragons" reveal how deeply these old maps live in our collective subconscious. Video games like the Elder Scrolls scatter bestiaries across their landscapes, much like medieval monks doodling blemmy in the margins. Netflix's The Witcher outfits its Nilfgaardian scouts with scrolls that wouldn't look out of place in a 14th century chancery, complete with skewed proportions and strategic omissions. The magic lies in the gaps, the uncharted forests where stories breed, the seas that might hide islands or leviathans. We've traded parchment for pixels, but the thrill of the unknown remains unchanged. Yet the real legacy of these maps isn't their monsters, it's their honesty about how knowledge works. Medieval cartographers didn't hide their uncertainty. They illustrated it, filling voids with creatures and legends as placeholders for the unexplored. In an age of Google Earth where every pixel is catalogued, we've lost something vital: the humility to admit how much we don't know. Climate change charts now label Arctic ice melt with the same urgency that once warned of boiling seas, and astrophysicists sketch black holes with the same tentative strokes that once framed the Garden of Eden. The difference: medieval mapmakers wore their ignorance proudly, turning blank spaces into invitations rather than failures. What they understood, and what we often forget, is that every map is a confession. It reveals not just the world as it is, but as the mapmaker believes it to be. The Hereford mappaemundi's Jerusalem-centric universe and Mercator's inflated Europe both tell us more about their creators' priorities than about geography. Today's algorithms, quietly nudging us towards certain landmarks or political borders, aren't so different. The lesson isn't that old maps were wrong, it's that all maps are narratives shaped by the biases and blind spots of their time. So the next time you trace a finger across a fantasy realm's inked coastline, remember, you're not just following a path, you're reading a story, one that began centuries ago, when the edges of the world were still drawn in wonder. The blank spaces on medieval maps weren't just gaps in knowledge, they were mirrors reflecting humanity's deepest instincts. When a cartographer sketched a dragon at the edge of the known world, he wasn't merely doodling. He was obeying a psychological impulse as old as storytelling itself, the terror of the unexplained. Our brains recoil from vacuums of information, rushing to fill them with narratives, whether divine or monstrous. Medieval scholars, lacking satellite imagery, turned to scripture and folklore to stitch coherence into the chaos. But strip away the parchment and ink, and you'll find the same cognitive machinery driving modern conspiracy theories or panic over artificial intelligence. The tools have changed, but the mind behind them hasn't. Consider the Hereford mappaemundi's depiction of the Earth's southern reaches as a wasteland of fire-breathing beasts. This wasn't random fantasy, it was a defense mechanism. Faced with the unknowable, the medieval mind defaulted to a simple equation: unexplored equals dangerous. The same pattern echoes today when unfamiliar technologies spark doomsday predictions, or when social media algorithms amplify fears of shadowy, ill-defined threats. Our neural wiring still equates the unknown with peril, just as it did when sailors whispered of sea serpents beyond the horizon. Yet medieval maps also reveal our gentler coping mechanisms. Legends like Prester John's Christian Kingdom or the Earthly Paradise weren't just wishful thinking, they were psychological balm. In a world riddled with plagues and wars, the idea that goodness lurked somewhere beyond the map's edge offered hope. Fast forward to modern UFO lore or fantasies about hidden advanced civilizations. These too are secularized versions of the same longing for redemption lurking just out of sight. The medium has shifted from parchment to podcasts, but the impulse remains unchanged. We'd rather invent comforting fictions than sit with uncertainty. The most striking parallel lies in how authority shapes belief. When a medieval monk labeled Africa as the land of the Blemii, his audience accepted it not because of evidence, but because he spoke from within a trusted institution, the church. Today, viral misinformation spreads through a similar dynamic. A tweet from a verified account or a YouTube video with slick production can override skepticism simply because it feels authoritative. The packaging has modernized, but the cognitive vulnerability to institutional trust remains identical. What medieval mapmakers understood, and what we often forget, is that ignorance isn't a blank slate. It's a projection screen. The monsters they drew were never really about geography. They were about the uncharted territories of the human psyche. When we laugh at their naive mistakes, we miss the sobering truth: we're still drawing dragons. They just wear different skins now: algorithmic biases instead of sea serpents, climate denial instead of flat earth dogma. The real lesson of these maps isn't how far we've come, but how little the contours of our imagination have changed. So the next time you feel certain about something you've never seen or touched, pause. Ask yourself, am I looking at evidence, or am I filling the void with my own "here be dragons"? That simple question, more than any modern map, might be the truest compass we have. Satellite images don't just show us the Earth, they reveal the blind spots of centuries past with brutal clarity. Take the phantom island of High Brassel, once drawn off Ireland's coast on medieval charts. Today, a quick zoom across the Atlantic on Google Earth confirms its absence, the ocean's surface unbroken where cartographers swore land should be. Archaeology has been just as ruthless, dismantling myths layer by layer. The Gates of Alexander, long believed to imprison Gog and Magog's hordes in Central Asia, crumbled under the scrutiny of ground-penetrating radar and drone surveys. Just another mountain pass, not a divine barrier. Yet for every myth dispelled, a tantalizing question lingers. The Vinland map, with its controversial depiction of Norse settlements in North America, still sparks heated debates. Carbon dating and ink analysis swing between condemning it as a clever forgery and hinting it might hold whispers of pre-Columbian voyages. The line between fraud and discovery remains as blurred as the edges of a medieval parchment. What's fascinating isn't just the corrections, it's how they ripple beyond academic journals. When LiDAR technology peeled back the Amazon's canopy to expose sprawling ancient cities, it didn't just rewrite history books, it gave indigenous communities tangible proof of their ancestors' sophistication, countering colonial narratives of untamed wilderness. Similarly, the debunking of the torrid zone myth that equatorial regions were uninhabitable didn't merely update atlases. It opened floodgates for trade, migration, and cultural exchange that reshaped economies. Every time science erases a medieval error, it's not just fixing a map, it's dismantling a worldview. But the work is never done. For every high brassel crossed off the charts, a new mystery emerges. Satellite anomalies still spark speculation about lost cities, while deep-sea sonar picks up shapes that could be shipwrecks or just odd geology. The process mirrors medieval cartographers' own struggles. The more we uncover, the more we realize how much we've yet to learn. The difference: today's explorers wield spectral imaging instead of sextants, and their dragons are gaps in data rather than ink monsters. Yet the thrill remains the same, the sense that the next discovery might lurk just beyond the edge of the known, waiting to redraw our mental maps once more. This isn't just about accuracy, it's about humility. Medieval mapmakers left us a powerful legacy, the courage to admit uncertainty. Their blank spaces labeled "Here be mysteries" were invitations, not failures. In an age where algorithms pretend to know our every preference and AI generates answers with eerie confidence, there's wisdom in those old, hesitant strokes of the quill. The world is still full of edges we haven't charted, and the most honest maps, whether drawn on vellum or rendered in pixels, are the ones that leave room for wonder. The dragons and misplaced continents of medieval maps weren't just harmless fictions, they were the misinformation campaigns of their day, with consequences that rippled across centuries. When European cartographers labeled distant lands as realms of monsters or barbarians, they weren't merely filling blank spaces, they were scripting narratives that justified conquest and otherness. The infamous "Here be dragons" wasn't a whimsical doodle, it was a deterrent, a way to frame the unknown as inherently dangerous. This deliberate distortion delayed exploration, as sailors avoided routes marked with mythical perils and fueled xenophobic ideologies that painted foreign cultures as subhuman. The Blemii, those fictional headless men of Africa, didn't vanish from maps when explorers proved them false. They morphed into stereotypes used to dehumanize real people, easing the conscience of colonizers. Fast forward to today, and the parallels are unsettling. Algorithms, like medieval scribes, amplify biases by feeding us content that confirms existing beliefs, creating digital echo chambers as insular as any TO map. Fake news spreads like those travelers' tales of dog-headed tribes, unverified, sensational, and sticky. The same cognitive shortcuts that made Prester John's kingdom feel real now make conspiracy theories go viral. The human brain craves narratives, even at the cost of truth. The difference: medieval misinformation moved at the speed of parchment, ours travels at the speed of light. Yet history offers a counter-playbook. just as Renaissance scholars cross-referenced Marco Polo's accounts with Arab star charts, we can learn to triangulate sources. Fra Mauri's willingness to admit ignorance on his map, labeling gaps plainly rather than filling them with fantasy models, a radical honesty we desperately need today. Embracing uncertainty, as those old cartographers eventually had to, is the antidote to the arrogance of algorithms that claim to know us better than we know ourselves. The real lesson isn't that we've outgrown medieval errors, it's that we've digitized them. Every time we share unverified claims or accept a trending topic as truth, we're inking our own monsters onto the blank spaces of understanding. But here's the hope. Just as science and exploration slowly corrected those old maps, critical thinking and curiosity can redraw ours. The next time you encounter a modern-day dragon, whether it's a viral rumor or a biased dataset, ask yourself, is this a warning or just another myth waiting to be debunked? The edges of our knowledge will always tempt us to fill them with fiction. The challenge is learning to leave them blank until the real picture comes into focus. Medieval maps were wrong, but they weren't foolish, they were human. Every line inked onto those parchments spoke to the hopes, fears, and burning questions of their time. They weren't failed attempts at modern accuracy, they were something far richer, collages of knowledge, faith, and imagination, stitched together with the threads of what people believed to be true. When a cartographer drew the Garden of Eden at the edge of Asia or sketched a sea serpent coiling around an unknown ocean, he wasn't lying. He was doing what we all do, making sense of the world with the tools he had. And what tools they were, limited by the reach of ships and the reliability of travelers' tales. These mapmakers turned gaps into stories, blending Ptolemy's ancient coordinates with biblical parables and the occasional tall tale from a spice merchant. The result, a world where the Nile might spring from paradise, where the Atlantic boiled at its edges, and where Jerusalem sat at the heart of everything, not because it was geographically central, but because it was spiritually indispensable. These weren't mistakes, they were choices, reflecting values over veracity. Yet these wrong maps shaped history in ways their creators never imagined. Columbus sailed west because his charts told him Asia was closer than it was. Crusaders marched toward Jerusalem believing it was the world's literal midpoint. Empires rose and fell on the strength of geographic myths, from the phantom kingdom of Prester John to the fabled riches of Cathay. The irony, many of history's boldest ventures were fueled by errors, proof that even misinformation can move mountains for better or worse. But the real lesson isn't about the past, it's about us. Today, we pride ourselves on satellite precision and real-time data. Yet our own maps, whether algorithmic, political, or social, are just as shaped by unseen biases. Climate models debate the boundaries of uninhabitable zones, much like medieval scholars once argued over the torrid zone. AI-generated landscapes inherit the blind spots of their training data, echoing the way mappaemundi copied ancient errors for centuries. Even our digital dragons, the edge cases and unknowns of technology, tempt us to fill voids with fear or fantasy. The medium has changed, but the human instinct remains the same. So the next time you glance at a GPS or scroll through a digital globe, spare a thought for those old parchment dreamers. Their maps were flawed, but they dared to ask the big questions. What lies beyond the known? How do we navigate uncertainty, and where, in all this vastness, do we belong? Those questions still matter, maybe now more than ever. If this journey through the margins of medieval geography sparked your curiosity, let's keep the conversation going. Hit like if you'd have trusted these maps on your own voyages, subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners, and drop a comment below. If you were a medieval cartographer, what mythical creature would you scribble at the edge of your world? A dragon, a griffin, or something stranger, the uncharted?